The lake stretched before them like a sheet of black glass, its surface broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the dock. Ellie pulled her cardigan tighter as the October wind cut through the fabric, watching Michael skip stones with the same boyish enthusiasm that had first made her fall in love with him 12 years ago. "Come on, Elle!" "Just one more," he called out, his voice echoing across the water. She shook her head, laughing despite the chill in the air. "It's getting late, Michael. We should head back." But he was already wading in, his pants rolled up to his knees, chasing after a particularly smooth stone that had caught his eye. That's when it happened, so quickly that Ellie's mind struggled to process what she was seeing. One moment Michael was bent over, reaching for the stone, and the next he was thrashing in the water, his shocked cry cutting through the evening air like a blade. The icy water had stolen his breath, his coordination. Panic seized him as the lake's deceptive depth swallowed his legs, his waist, his chest. Without thinking, Ellie kicked off her shoes and plunged in after him. The cold hit her like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs in a violent gasp. But adrenaline pushed her forward, her arms cutting through the frigid water with desperate efficiency. She reached Michael just as his head disappeared beneath the surface, her fingers finding the collar of his jacket. With strength she didn't know she possessed, she hauled him toward shore, his dead weight threatening to drag them both under. "I've got you," she gasped, her lips already blue with cold. "I've got you." They made it to the rocky shore, both of them shaking violently, Michael coughing up lake water while Ellie helped him to his feet. Relief flooded through her. They were safe. They were alive. They would laugh about this someday. That's when her foot found the patch of moss-covered stone. The world tilted. Ellie felt herself falling backward, a strange slow-motion sensation that seemed to last forever. When her spine connected with the jagged rock behind her, the sound was wrong, a wet crack that seemed to echo in her bones. The pain was immediate and absolute, radiating through her body like lightning. Michael's face appeared above her, his eyes wide with terror. "Ellie? Ellie, can you move?" She tried. God, she tried. But her legs felt distant, disconnected, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. The numbness spread upward like spilled ink, and with it came an understanding that made her stomach lurch with more violence than the lake water ever could. Permanent. The word hung in the sterile hospital air 3 days later like a death sentence. Dr. Feist's voice was gentle but unyielding as he explained the damage to her L2 vertebra, the severed connections that would never heal. Ellie stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the water stains while Michael's hand squeezed hers with desperate intensity. At home, he transformed their bedroom into a sanctuary. He learned to lift her, to help her bathe, to navigate the complex choreography of caring for someone whose body had become a stranger to itself. For weeks, his love felt like armor against the crushing weight of her new reality. But armor, Ellie would learn, can become a cage. The changes came slowly, like water wearing away stone. Michael began staying late at the office, his explanations growing increasingly vague. "Big project," he'd mutter, avoiding her eyes. Then came the nights he didn't come home at all, claiming client dinners and work emergencies that seemed to multiply with each passing week. 6 months after the accident, as autumn gave way to winter, Michael stood in their bedroom doorway, his face hard with an anger she'd never seen before. But this wasn't sudden rage. This was something that had been building for weeks, maybe months, like pressure behind a dam. "You should have been more careful," he said, the words falling like stones into still water. "None of this would have happened if you'd just been more careful." Ellie felt her breath catch. In all the months since the accident, through all his growing distance and increasingly cold silences, he had never once blamed her for what happened. She had blamed herself enough for both of them. "Michael, what are you talking about? I was trying to save you. I would have been fine." The words exploded out of him. "I was getting my footing back. But you had to jump in, had to be the hero. And look where it got us." Michael began pacing at the foot of the bed, his hands running through his hair in a gesture she'd once found endearing, but now seemed manic. "Do you have any idea what my life has become?" he continued, his voice rising. "I wake up every morning knowing that my day will be spent lifting you, washing you, feeding you. I can't go out with friends because you need me. I can't work late because you need me. I can't even sleep through the night because you need me." I never asked. "You didn't have to ask." He spun to face her, his eyes blazing. "That's the point, Ellie. You didn't ask, but here we are anyway. This is what I have to look forward to for the next 50 years. The cruelty in his voice was breathtaking. Ellie felt tears starting, but she forced them back. "I know it's hard. I know this isn't what either of us planned, but the doctors said with time, with physical therapy." "The doctors said a lot of things." Michael's laugh was bitter. "They said you might regain some sensation. They said you might be able to use a wheelchair independently. They said a lot of maybes and mights and possiblies. But what they didn't say, what no one wants to say, is that this is probably it. This is probably as good as it gets." He stopped pacing and stared at her, really stared, as if seeing her clearly for the first time in months. The look in his eyes was cold, appraising, like he was calculating the value of something he was considering discarding. "I never signed up for this." The words came out, measured now, deliberate. "I married a woman who could walk, who could be a partner instead of a burden." The words hung in the air like poison, seeping into every corner of their bedroom until Ellie could hardly breathe. Michael stood at the foot of their bed, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above her head. Honestly, what man in his right mind would agree to spend the rest of his life with a bedridden woman? The casual cruelty of it stole her breath. This wasn't the Michael who used to bring her coffee in bed on Sunday mornings, who would trace patterns on her back while she fell asleep. This stranger wearing her husband's face spoke as if she were already dead, as if the woman who had risked everything to save his life had ceased to exist the moment her spine shattered on that rock. Ellie studied his profile, searching for any trace of the man she'd married. "What happened to you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't believe I'm hearing this from you." "From you, Michael." He finally looked at her then, and what she saw in his eyes was worse than anger. It was nothing. Complete, hollow nothing. "I understand you're stressed," she continued, her voice growing stronger despite the tremor in her hands. "I understand this isn't what either of us planned. But at least be honest with yourself. At least have the courage to tell it to my face instead of hiding behind these excuses." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Ellie felt tears beginning to blur her vision, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I'm not scared of being left alone, Michael. I'd rather be alone than with someone who can't be honest, someone without dignity." The tears came then, hot and relentless, streaming down her cheeks as 6 months of suppressed pain and fear finally broke free. She sobbed for the life they'd lost, for the man he used to be, for the woman she'd never be again. Through it all, Michael remained statue still, his face an impenetrable mask. When her tears finally subsided, he moved with mechanical precision. No words, no explanation, no goodbye, just the methodical sound of drawers opening and closing, hangers scraping against the closet rod, zippers being pulled shut. Each sound was a small violence, a deliberate erasure of their shared history. Ellie watched him pack their wedding photo face down in a box, watched him roll up the sweater she'd knitted him last Christmas, and stuff it carelessly into a duffel bag. When he lifted his pillow from their bed, she caught a whiff of his cologne, the same scent that used to comfort her in the dark hours after the accident, when nightmares would wake her gasping. The front door closed with a soft click that echoed through the house like a gunshot. Ellie lay in the sudden silence, staring at the empty space where his side of the closet used to be. The walls seemed to press in around her, the familiar room transformed into something foreign and hostile. She pulled the blanket over her head and wept until her body had no more tears to give, until exhaustion finally claimed her. The next morning brought the cruel illusion of normalcy, until she remembered. The emptiness hit her anew, a physical weight pressing down on her chest. She spent the day learning the new geography of solitude, counting ceiling tiles and memorizing the pattern of shadows as they moved across the floor. It was just after noon when she heard the key in the lock. Her heart stopped, then hammered against her ribs with desperate hope. He's back. He came back. It was all some terrible mistake, some cruel joke he'll apologize for with tears in his eyes. The fantasy bloomed in her chest like a flower, bright and impossible and so desperately needed. "Michael!" she called out, her voice cracking with relief. His footsteps moved through the house with purpose, coming closer. When he appeared in the doorway, she drank in the sight of him like water after a drought. But something was wrong. His expression was closed, businesslike. "I forgot something," he said without preamble, walking to his nightstand. The hope in Ellie's chest shriveled and died as she watched him retrieve his grandfather's pocket watch, the one he'd inherited when they were still newlyweds. He'd worn it on their wedding day. "That's all," he said, slipping the watch into his jacket pocket. "I won't bother you again." And then he was gone, leaving behind only the fading echo of his footsteps and the devastating finality of his words. The crash was worse than the first time. Ellie's renewed grief felt like drowning in reverse. Instead of water rushing into her lungs, it was air being violently expelled, leaving her gasping and empty. She screamed into her pillow until her throat was raw, raged against the unfairness of a world that would save a man's life only to let him destroy the woman who'd saved him. For 3 days she existed in a twilight state of denial and despair. Food held no appeal. Water tasted like ash. She lay motionless, waiting for something, death maybe, or a miracle that would undo everything that had happened since that terrible October evening. But on the 4th day, something shifted. The hunger pangs were impossible to ignore, and more than that, the indignity of lying helpless in her own misery finally sparked something resembling anger. She was not going to die in this bed, abandoned and pitied. She was not going to let his weakness become her grave. The journey to the floor was agony. Her arms, weakened by months of limited use, shook with the effort of lowering herself down. But she made it, and then began the humiliating crawl to the kitchen, her palms raw against the hardwood, her useless legs dragging behind her. Every movement sent shockwaves of pain through her body, but with each inch forward she felt something returning. Not hope exactly, but will. The stubborn, fierce determination that had once driven her into icy water to save a drowning man. By the time she reached the kitchen counter, she was sobbing again. But these tears were different. They tasted of salt and fury and the bitter recognition that if she was going to survive this, it would have to be entirely on her own terms. With trembling fingers, she reached for her phone to order groceries, taking the first small step toward whatever life awaited her on the other side of abandonment. Kyle Marlowe shifted the weight of the produce boxes in his arms as he approached the modest house. The autumn air carried the crisp scent of dying leaves, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of children playing, a sound that used to bring him comfort, but now only reminded him of everything he'd lost. 2 months into this job, and he still felt like he was wearing someone else's clothes. The green polo shirt with farm fresh produce, embroidered on the pocket, hung loose on his frame, a frame that had once filled out carpenter's overalls and plumber's coveralls with the confidence of a man who knew the value of his hands. Now those same hands, weathered and scarred from 18 months in Millbrook Correctional, carried boxes of vegetables to people who would never know his real story, and who probably wouldn't care if they did. The order was simple enough: carrots, spinach, apples, bananas, and a bag of sweet potatoes. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the receipt read. He'd never delivered to this address before, which meant she was either new to town or new to having her groceries delivered. Most of his regular customers were elderly folks who couldn't drive anymore, or busy mothers juggling 3 kids and 2 jobs. Kyle had been grateful when Frank Delacroix hired him at the produce market. Frank was one of the few people in town who seemed to care more about a man's work ethic than his past, probably because Frank himself knew something about second chances. He'd lost his farm to debt 10 years ago and had to rebuild from nothing. "I don't care what you did," Frank had said during Kyle's interview, his weathered hands folded on the small desk in the back office. "I care what you're going to do." What Kyle was going to do, apparently, was pretend that every sideways glance from former neighbours didn't feel like a knife between his ribs. Pretend that the whispers in the hardware store, "That's him, the one who killed the Patterson boy," didn't follow him home at night. Pretend that coming home to an empty apartment, to divorce papers on the kitchen table, and a note that said simply, "I can't do this anymore, Kyle." "I'm sorry," hadn't hollowed him out like a rotted tree. The worst part wasn't even that Sarah had left. The worst part was that he understood why. Kyle rang the doorbell and waited, shuffling the boxes to get a better grip. The house had that slightly neglected look that spoke of recent upheaval. Flower beds that needed attention, a newspaper still sitting on the step from yesterday. He rang again, then checked his watch. It was 2:30 in the afternoon, well within the delivery window he'd promised. No answer. This happened sometimes. People ordered groceries and then forgot, or had to step out unexpectedly. Protocol was simple: leave the perishables in a cooler bag by the door and move on to the next delivery. But something about this house made him hesitate. Maybe it was the way the curtains were drawn tight against the afternoon sun, or the fact that he could swear he'd heard movement inside when he first approached. Kyle pulled out his phone and dialed the number from the order form. "Hello?" The voice that answered was soft, cautious. "Hi, this is Kyle from Farm Fresh Produce. I'm at your door with your grocery delivery, but I'm not getting an answer when I ring the bell." A pause. Then, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't hear the bell." Another pause, longer this time. "Could you... This is going to sound strange, but could you possibly bring the groceries inside and put them in the refrigerator for me?" Kyle blinked, taken aback. In 2 months of deliveries, no one had ever asked him to come inside. Most people barely opened their doors wide enough to accept the boxes, as if he might contaminate their homes with his presence. "I'm really sorry to ask," the voice continued, and now he could hear embarrassment creeping in. "I know it's not normal, but I can't. It's difficult for me to get to the door right now." There was something in her tone that stopped Kyle from giving his standard response about company policy. Something vulnerable and raw that he recognized, the sound of someone trying to hold themselves together when everything was falling apart. "It's no big deal," he said, surprising himself. "I'll be right there." The front door was unlocked, which should have struck him as odd, but Kyle was too focused on the strange heaviness in the air inside the house. It felt like a place where time had stopped, where life had been interrupted mid-sentence. The living room was tidy but somehow lifeless, as if no one had really lived in it for months. "Kitchen's through there," came the voice from somewhere deeper in the house, down a hallway he couldn't see. Kyle made his way to the kitchen, noting the adaptive equipment scattered around. A reacher grabber on the counter, pill organizers lined up with military precision, a small refrigerator that sat lower than normal. The pieces clicked together in his mind as he opened the main refrigerator and began organizing the produce. "Thank you," came the voice again, closer now. "I know this is probably against your company rules or something." Kyle closed the refrigerator and turned toward the sound. Through an open doorway he could see into what must have been a converted bedroom. A hospital bed dominated the space, and in it, a woman who looked to be in her early 30s watched him with eyes that held too much knowledge of suffering. "Like I said, it's no big deal." Kyle found himself moving closer to the doorway, drawn by something he couldn't name. "I'm Kyle, by the way. Ellie." She tried to smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you for not making me explain." Kyle understood then. He recognized the particular shame of having to ask for help with things that used to be simple. the exhaustion that came from having to justify your existence to a world that suddenly saw you as broken. He'd felt it every time he'd had to check the box marked felon on job applications, every time someone's expression changed when they learned where he'd spent the last few years. "We all need help sometimes," he said simply. Kyle had almost reached the front door when he heard it, a soft thump followed by what sounded like stifled frustration. He paused, his hand on the doorknob, listening. The sound came again, accompanied by what he could only describe as determined struggling. Against his better judgment, he turned back. Through the open doorway to the converted bedroom, he could see Ellie stretched across her bed, reaching desperately for something just beyond her grasp. A water bottle sat on the nightstand, maybe 18 inches away from her fingertips, close enough to see, far enough to be impossibly distant given her circumstances. Her hospital gown had ridden up, revealing the motionless legs beneath thin blankets, and her hair was matted with what looked like days of neglect. She was making small sounds of effort, trying to leverage herself closer to the nightstand using just her arms. But every time she got within inches of the bottle, her weakened muscles would give out, and she'd slide back across the bed, further from her goal than when she started. Kyle watched this struggle for perhaps 10 seconds before his conscience overrode his hesitation. "Do you need help with that?" he asked gently from the doorway. Ellie froze, her face flushing with mortification at being caught in such a vulnerable position. "I'm fine," she said quickly, not meeting his eyes. "Really, I can get it." But even as she spoke, she was reaching again, her arm trembling with the effort, her fingertips still inches short of the water bottle. Kyle could see the defeat in her posture, the way her shoulders sagged with exhaustion that went far beyond physical fatigue. "I can see that you're trying really hard," Kyle said carefully, "but it looks like you could use a hand." I said I'm fine, but her voice cracked on the last word and they both heard it. Kyle took a tentative step into the room. "I'm sorry for walking in, but..." He moved past her to the nightstand and picked up the water bottle, holding it out to her. "Here." Ellie's hands shook as she accepted it, and she drank like someone who'd been walking in the desert for days. Kyle watched her throat work, noted the desperate way she tilted the bottle to get every last drop. When she finally lowered it, there were tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Kyle looked around the room more carefully now, taking in details he'd missed during his initial mission. The sheets were rumpled and stained, clearly unchanged for days. Empty food containers sat on the floor beside the bed, crackers mostly, things that required no preparation. The smell in the air wasn't just stale. It was the smell of someone who hadn't been able to properly care for themselves in far too long. "Are you sure everything's okay?" he asked, though the evidence suggested it clearly wasn't. "It's fine. My back just hurts, so I've been in bed for a while." Kyle studied her face, noting the dark circles under her eyes, the way her skin had that grey pallor that came from poor nutrition and despair. "It doesn't look like your back has just been hurting since yesterday." Something in his tone, not accusatory, just gently persistent, seemed to crack something inside Ellie. Her composure, already fragile, began to crumble. "How long has it been since someone helped you?" Kyle pressed, but not unkindly. "I don't need..." Ellie started, then stopped. Her hands were shaking again, and not from the effort of reaching for water. "I can take care of myself." "I'm sure you can." "But how long?" The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Kyle waited, recognizing the moment when someone was deciding whether to trust another person with their pain. "A week," she finally whispered. "He left a week ago." The words came out broken, each one seeming to cost her something. Kyle felt his chest tighten as the pieces clicked together, the adaptive equipment, the hospital bed, the way she'd asked him to come inside, the desperate reach for a water bottle that might as well have been on the moon. "I'm bedridden," she continued, the words tumbling out now like water through a broken dam. "My spine. There was an accident. I can't walk, I can't... And the only person I was depending on, he left." He said no man in his right mind would... She couldn't finish the sentence. Kyle felt something hot and fierce rise in his chest, anger at the kind of man who would abandon someone so vulnerable, but also something else. Recognition, maybe. He knew what it felt like to have the world decide you were no longer worthy of basic human consideration. Jesus, he breathed. I'm so sorry. Ellie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, embarrassment colouring her cheeks. I'm sorry. I shouldn't be dumping this on a stranger. You've already done more than enough, and I'm making you feel sorry for me. You're not making me do anything, Kyle said firmly. And even if you were, there's nothing wrong with needing help. He looked around the room again, his contractor's eye automatically assessing what needed to be done. It was overwhelming, but not impossible. Just a series of tasks that needed tackling one at a time. Look, he said, I know this might sound strange coming from someone you just met, but I want to help. I need you to know, though, I'm not a monster. You don't have to be afraid of me. Ellie looked at him with confusion. I'm not afraid of you. Kyle nodded, choosing his next words carefully. Good. Because I'm going to say something that might sound bad, but you need a bath, and I'm going to help you with that if you'll let me. The silence that followed was different from before, not heavy with despair, but charged with possibility. Ellie stared at him as if trying to determine whether he was real or some figment of her desperate imagination. I'll do my best not to look where I'm not supposed to, Kyle continued, but you can't keep living like this. It's not safe, and it's not right. Nobody should have to live like this. Ellie's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they seemed different. I don't understand why you're doing this. Because someone needs to, Kyle said simply. And I happen to be here. What followed was perhaps the most careful, respectful hour of Kyle's life. He filled the bathtub with warm water, helped Ellie transfer from her bed to the wheelchair he found in the closet, and then, with infinite patience and deliberate averting of his eyes, helped her out of clothes that had clearly been worn too long. The process required a tenderness Kyle hadn't known he possessed. He washed her hair with the same gentle attention he might have used on something precious and breakable, helped her soap her arms and back, all while maintaining a steady stream of casual conversation designed to preserve what dignity he could. You know, I learned to be pretty handy in the kitchen, he said as he helped her back into clean pajamas he'd found in her dresser. Nothing fancy, but I can make a decent meal out of almost anything. You don't have to... I know I don't have to. But when's the last time you had a real meal? Something hot and filling? Ellie couldn't remember. The past week had been a blur of crackers and whatever she could reach from her bedside stash of non-perishables. Kyle raided her kitchen and produced what he privately considered a minor miracle. A pasta dish with vegetables and a simple cream sauce made from ingredients he found in her pantry and the produce he'd delivered. He didn't mention that he'd learned to cook in the prison cafeteria, where making something edible from limited ingredients was both an art and a survival skill. As Ellie ate, and Kyle was gratified to see her eat with real appetite for the first time in days, she watched him with an expression of wonder that made his chest ache. I just don't understand, she said between bites. People don't just do this. Strangers don't just show up and take care of someone they don't even know. Kyle stirred his own pasta, thinking about Sarah's note on the kitchen table, about the job interviews where he'd been dismissed the moment they ran his background check, about the way his former friends had looked right through him as if 18 months had erased his existence entirely. Maybe they should, he said quietly. But why? Why are you doing this? Kyle set down his fork and really looked at her. This woman who'd been abandoned in her moment of greatest need, who'd been struggling alone in a bed she couldn't leave, reaching for water bottles like they were lifelines. Because, he said, I know what it's like when the world decides you don't matter anymore. I know what it's like to need help and have everyone turn away. Ellie's eyes searched his face, clearly sensing there was more to his story. "What happened to you?" Kyle hesitated. He could feel the weight of his past like a stone in his chest, the trial, the conviction, the way everything he'd built had crumbled the moment the judge's gavel fell. But looking at Ellie, clean and fed, and no longer reaching desperately for things just out of her grasp, he realized that maybe his story didn't have to define how he helped someone else write theirs. "That's a conversation for another day," he said with a small smile. "Right now, let's just say I'm someone who knows a thing or two about starting over." Ellie nodded, as if understanding that some stories took time to tell. "I can't believe this isn't a dream." Kyle stood to clear their dishes, pausing to look back at her. She looked so different from the desperate woman he'd found reaching for a water bottle. Still fragile, still bearing the weight of recent trauma, but somehow more present, more alive. "It's not a dream," he said. "Sometimes help just shows up when you need it most." But even as he said it, Kyle knew there was more to it than that. There was something about Ellie, maybe the way she'd tried to preserve her dignity, even in the midst of her desperation, or the gratitude in her eyes that held no trace of pity for herself, that made him want to be better than he'd been, made him want to be the kind of man who showed up when someone needed help, instead of the kind who got shown the door when his past caught up with him. He wasn't ready to examine that feeling too closely. Not yet. For now, it was enough to wash dishes and know that when he left, Ellie would be clean and fed and safe for at least one more day. Sometimes, Kyle thought as he dried the last plate, that was all anyone could ask for. One more day, and the hope that tomorrow might bring another small kindness from an unexpected source. That evening, long after Kyle's footsteps had faded from the front porch, Ellie lay in her clean sheets, staring at the ceiling with a feeling she hadn't experienced in so long she'd almost forgotten its name. Hope. 24 hours ago, she had been ready to surrender. The weight of abandonment, the crushing reality of her limitations, the suffocating silence of a house that had become a prison. It had all conspired to convince her that this half-life wasn't worth living. She had closed her eyes the night before, expecting, maybe even wanting, not to wake up. But now, with the taste of real food still lingering on her tongue and the memory of gentle hands helping her feel human again, everything had shifted. The same ceiling she'd stared at in despair now seemed full of possibility. Tomorrow couldn't come fast enough. She wanted to know what Kyle would bring, what he would say, what small miracle he might work in her carefully ordered world of limitation and loss. Who was this man who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was praying? For the first time since Michael walked out, Ellie slept deeply, dreamlessly, the kind of restorative sleep that comes only when the body finally believes it's safe. The next day crawled by with excruciating slowness. Kyle hadn't specified when he'd return, just tomorrow. And Ellie found herself listening for every car that passed, every footstep on the sidewalk. She'd never anticipated anyone this intensely, not even in the early days with Michael when every phone call had made her heart skip. When Kyle finally appeared in the early afternoon, carrying what looked like supplies from a hardware store along with another bag of groceries, Ellie's face split into a grin that surprised them both with its intensity. "You're back," she said, as if she still couldn't quite believe it. "I said I would be." Kyle's own smile was quieter but no less genuine. "How are you feeling?" "Better. So much better." Without fanfare, Kyle set about transforming her space. He installed grab bars in the bathroom, rearranged furniture to create clearer pathways, and tackled the accumulated chaos of someone who had been struggling alone for too long. Watching him work, Ellie marveled at the competence in his movements, the way he seemed to instinctively understand what she needed before she knew it herself. And so began a routine that neither of them named but both came to depend on. Kyle would arrive in the afternoons after his deliveries, Sometimes with groceries, sometimes with small improvements for the house, always with that quiet presence that made everything seem manageable. A week into this new arrangement, as Kyle was installing a raised toilet seat, another modification Ellie hadn't known she needed, she finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been burning in her chest. "Kyle, why are you doing this?" He paused, wrench in hand, and she could see something shift in his expression. The easy companionability they'd developed suddenly felt fragile. "I mean it," she pressed. "No one does this. No one just shows up in someone's life and saves them. There has to be a reason." Kyle set down the wrench and sat heavily on the edge of the bathtub. For a long moment he stared at his hands that she'd noticed were scarred in ways that spoke of both hard work and hard times. "You really want to know?" "Yes. It's not a pretty story. I'm not looking for pretty. I'm looking for true." Kyle nodded slowly as if making a decision that had been weighing on him for days. "I was married," he began. "Sarah. We were together 8 years, married for 5. I loved her more than I thought it was possible to love another person." His voice was steady, but Ellie could hear the pain underneath. "One night we were walking home from dinner. It was late, maybe 11 o'clock. This guy came out of nowhere, high on something, desperate. He had a knife." Ellie's breath caught, but she didn't interrupt. He wanted Sarah's purse, but when she tried to give it to him, he grabbed her, put the knife to her throat, started saying things about what else he wanted to take. Kyle's hands clenched into fists. I couldn't just stand there and watch, so I fought him." "Of course you did." "I didn't mean to kill him. I just pushed him hard and he fell backward and hit his head on the curb. But he was from a wealthy family, the Pattersons. They had connections, money, influence. And I was just a contractor with a public defender who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else." Ellie felt her heart breaking for this man who had saved his wife only to lose everything. "The judge decided I was guilty of voluntary manslaughter. 5 years in Millbrook." Kyle's voice went flat, the way people's voices do when they're reciting facts too painful to feel. "I thought Sarah would wait. I thought when I got out we'd pick up where we left off, maybe even stronger for having survived it. But she didn't wait. I came home to divorce papers and a note. She'd moved in with her boss, a guy she'd been working with while I was inside. The note said she couldn't handle being married to someone with a record, that she needed to think about her future." Ellie reached out instinctively, her fingers finding his. "I'm so sorry." Kyle looked down at their joined hands with something like wonder. The worst part wasn't even that she left. It was coming back to a town where everyone knew what happened, but nobody wanted to hear the real story. "I used to be the guy people called when their sink backed up or their roof leaked. I helped build half the decks in this neighborhood, but after prison, suddenly nobody wanted me in their house. Nobody wanted to hire the killer. But you're not—" "I know that. You know that. But the town had already decided who I was." Kyle's thumb brushed across her knuckles. "Frank Delacroix was the only person willing to give me a chance. And even then, it was delivery work, keeping me away from customers as much as possible." Understanding dawned on Ellie's face. "Until you met me." "Until I met you," Kyle confirmed. "You asked me to put groceries in your refrigerator." Such a small thing, but it was the first time in months that someone needed my help with something that mattered. It was the first time I felt useful, human. Tears were sliding down Ellie's cheeks now. "I kept coming back because helping you reminded me of who I used to be. Before prison, before Sarah, before everyone decided I was dangerous, I was the kind of person who fixed things, who made things better. With you, I could be that person again." They sat in the small bathroom, hands linked, both of them crying quietly for the different ways the world had broken them. From that day forward, something shifted between them. The help Kyle provided became more intentional, more forward-looking. He researched physical therapists in the area and helped Ellie find one who would do house calls. He encouraged her through the brutal early days of rehabilitation, when every exercise felt like torture and progress was measured in millimeters. "Just because you can't walk the same way doesn't mean you can't walk," he told her during one particularly difficult session. "Your body is learning a new language. Be patient with it." Gradually, miraculously, Ellie began to reclaim pieces of herself she'd thought were lost forever. First came the wheelchair transfers, the ability to move from bed to chair without help. Then the standing exercises, Kyle's steady hands there to catch her if she faltered. Finally, the day she took her first tentative steps with crutches, Kyle cheering her on as if she'd just summited Everest. "I can't believe I'm actually moving," she laughed, tears streaming down her face as she managed 3 steps before needing to rest. "I never doubted it for a second," Kyle said, and she could see he meant it. Their days together became lighter, filled with laughter as well as hard work. Kyle had a dry wit that caught her off guard, and sometimes he could make her laugh so hard her healing muscles would protest. "Stop," she gasped one afternoon after he'd done a particularly accurate impression of her physical therapist. "My back hurts from laughing." "Good," Kyle grinned. "That means you're using muscles you haven't used in months." 6 months into their routine, Ellie made a request that surprised them both. "I want to see where you work, where you live." Kyle's expression grew complicated. "Ellie, I don't think—" "Please, I want to understand your life the way you've understood mine." So Kyle loaded her wheelchair into his delivery truck and drove her to Farm Fresh Produce, his cheeks burning with embarrassment as he showed her the small storage room behind the main shop where he'd been sleeping on a cot surrounded by boxes of inventory. "Kyle," Ellie breathed, taking in the cramped space, the few personal belongings, the evidence of a man making do with far less than he deserved. "You live here?" "It's temporary," he said quickly. "Frank lets me stay here while I save up for a deposit on an apartment. Nobody else would rent to me with my record." Ellie looked around the space, neat despite its limitations, with books stacked carefully on a makeshift shelf and a hot plate that served as Kyle's kitchen. "You work all day, then come take care of me, then come back here to this." "It's not so bad." But Ellie was shaking her head in amazement. "You're incredible." Frank Delacroix chose that moment to emerge from the office, his weathered face lighting up when he saw them together. "Kyle! You didn't tell me you were bringing a visitor." His eyes took in Ellie appreciatively. "And such a beautiful lady, too." "You've got good taste, my friend." Kyle's face went scarlet. "Frank, this is Ellie. We're just... Don't be embarrassed, Kyle," Frank chuckled, seemingly oblivious to his employee's mortification. "It's about time you found someone who appreciates what a good man you are." The ride home was quiet, both of them processing Frank's casual assumption and their own growing awareness that what had started as necessity had become something neither of them had expected. It was 2 weeks later, as Kyle was helping Ellie practice with her crutches in the backyard, that the moment finally arrived. She had managed to walk the length of the garden and back, her longest distance yet, and was glowing with accomplishment. "I did it," she said, slightly out of breath but radiant. "I actually did it." "You did," Kyle agreed, and something in his voice made her look at him more closely. "What is it?" Instead of answering, Kyle stepped closer, his hands coming up to frame her face. "Ellie, I need you to know that I never expected this." "I never expected you." Kyle dash. "I fell in love with your courage," he said softly. "The way you reach for things even when they seem impossible. The way you trusted me when you had every reason not to. The way you made me remember who I wanted to be." Ellie felt her breath catch. "I fell in love with your hands," she whispered back. "The way they're always so gentle, so careful. The way you touch everything like it matters." When Kyle kissed her, it was with the reverence of a man who had learned not to take tenderness for granted. And when Ellie kissed him back, It was with the fierce gratitude of someone who had discovered that love could arrive in the most unexpected packages, carried by the most unlikely messengers. They stood there in the garden holding each other as if they were the answer to questions they hadn't known they were asking, while the late afternoon sun painted everything golden around them. 2 years had transformed everything. Ellie stood at the kitchen window, watching Kyle tend to the vegetable garden he'd planted in their backyard now, in the little house they'd bought together 6 months after their wedding. Her legs, once lifeless and foreign, now supported her weight as she swayed gently, bouncing their 3-month-old daughter Victoria in her arms. The walking had come slowly, painfully, and never completely. She still needed her crutches for longer distances and had difficult days when her back screamed in protest. But she could stand. She could take steps. She could hold her baby and rock her to sleep. Miracles, all of them made possible by Kyle's unwavering belief that her body could heal and his patient presence through every grueling physical therapy session. "Look at your daddy," Ellie whispered to Victoria, whose dark eyes, Kyle's eyes, tracked the movement outside the window. "He's making sure we'll have fresh tomatoes all summer long." Their life together had bloomed like Kyle's garden, slowly at first, then with an abundance that sometimes took Ellie's breath away. The wedding had been small, just Frank Delacroix, as Kyle's best man and doctor. Feist as Ellie's witness, but it had felt perfect. Kyle had cried when she walked down the aisle of the little chapel, managing the distance with just her crutches and sheer determination. "I never thought I'd see you walking toward me on our wedding day," he'd whispered when she reached him. "I never thought I'd have a wedding day to walk toward," she'd whispered back. Victoria's arrival had been another miracle they'd hardly dared to hope for. The pregnancy had been challenging, requiring bed rest in the final months, but Kyle had been there for every moment, holding her hair when morning sickness struck, assembling the crib with tears in his eyes, coaching her through labour with the same patient encouragement he'd used during her first tentative steps. Now, watching him work in the garden while their daughter dozed in her arms, Ellie felt a gratitude so profound it seemed to vibrate in her bones. God had sent her an angel, she was certain of it. Not the kind with wings and halos, but the kind with work-roughened hands and eyes that saw possibility where others saw only limitation. The sharp knock at the front door interrupted her reverie. Victoria stirred, making the small fussing sounds that meant she'd wake soon if disturbed further. "I'll get it," Kyle called from the garden, pulling off his gloves as he headed for the front of the house. Ellie heard the door open, heard Kyle's voice take on a polite but wary tone. "Can I help you?" The response made her blood freeze. "I'm looking for Ellie." Ellie Hartwell. That voice. Slurred with alcohol but unmistakably familiar, the voice that had once promised to love her in sickness and in health, the same voice that had asked what man in his right mind would stay with a bedridden woman. "Who's asking?" Kyle's tone had shifted, becoming harder. "I'm Michael." Her husband. Ex-husband, Kyle corrected, and Ellie could hear the dangerous quiet that had crept into his voice. "What do you want with her?" "Who the hell are you to ask me that?" The sound that followed was sickening, the dull impact of fist-meeting flesh, followed by a heavy thud as a body hit the porch. Victoria startled in Ellie's arms, beginning to cry. "Shh, baby," Ellie murmured, but her heart was pounding as she heard Kyle's voice, low and furious. "Let me tell you who I am," Kyle was saying. "I'm the man who was here when you weren't. I'm the man who helped her eat when you left her starving. I'm the man who held her when she cried herself to sleep after you abandoned her." Michael's voice was weaker now, winded. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly. You're a coward who walked away from the woman you promised to protect, and now you have the nerve to come to our home drunk and demanding to see her. Your home. That's right. Our home. Our life. The life she built after you destroyed the one she had." The voices were getting louder, Victoria's cries more insistent. Despite every instinct telling her to stay inside, Ellie found herself moving toward the door. This confrontation had been inevitable, she realized. Michael's ghost had haunted the early days of her relationship with Kyle, and perhaps it was time to face it directly. She opened the door to find Michael sprawled on the porch, Kyle standing over him with his fists clenched. Michael looked terrible, unshaven, his clothes wrinkled and smelling of alcohol, his face bearing the hollow look of a man who had made choices he couldn't unmake. Michael's eyes went wide when he saw her, standing, holding a baby, alive and whole in ways that clearly defied everything he'd assumed about her condition. "Ellie?" He struggled to his feet, swaying slightly. "Whose baby is that?" "None of your business." Ellie's voice was steady, though her heart was racing. "But—" "How are you walking?" the doctors said. He stared at her legs as if they were an optical illusion. "I prayed for you, Ellie. Every day. I prayed that God would heal you, and he finally answered." Ellie felt Kyle tense beside her, ready to intervene, but she held up a hand. This was hers to handle. "You prayed for me." The laugh that escaped her was bitter. "While you were praying, this man was helping me learn to stand again. While you were praying, he was feeding me and bathing me and believing I could get better when I'd given up on myself." Michael's face flushed red. "But I'm your husband." "Ex-husband," both Ellie and Kyle said simultaneously. "My heart always told me to come back to you." Michael continued desperately. "That's why I'm here. We can start over. You just need to get rid of this." He gestured dismissively at Kyle. "This rascal." The word hit Ellie like a physical blow, bringing back the memory of their last conversation, the casual cruelty with which he'd dismissed their entire marriage. "Do you remember what you said to me?" she asked quietly. "You asked what man in his right mind would agree to spend his life with a bedridden woman." Michael had the grace to look ashamed. "I was upset." "I didn't mean—" "You meant every word." Ellie shifted Victoria to one arm and reached for Kyle's hand with the other. "Well, here's your answer. This man, right here, is the crazy one who dared to love a cripple. This man who saw me at my worst and decided I was worth saving." She took a step closer to Michael, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "You had your chance to be my hero, Michael. You chose to be my villain instead. Now you need to leave, because if you don't—" She glanced at Kyle, whose jaw was clenched tight with barely contained fury. "I can't promise you'll walk away from here." Michael followed her gaze, seemed to register for the first time that Kyle was not a man to be trifled with. Whatever he saw in Kyle's expression made him take a step back. Michael stumbled down the porch steps, nearly falling again in his haste to reach his car. They watched him drive away, his tail lights disappearing into the dusk. Kyle's hand found the small of Ellie's back as they stood in their doorway, their daughter now quiet in her mother's arms. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Ellie leaned into his touch, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady presence that had anchored her through every storm. "I'm perfect," she said, and meant it. "We're perfect." They went back inside their home, the home Kyle had made accessible with ramps and grab bars, the home where Victoria would grow up knowing that love meant staying, not leaving. As Kyle locked the door behind them, Ellie realized that Michael's visit hadn't shaken her. If anything, it had shown her how completely she'd healed, not just her body, but her heart. She had walked away from their confrontation on her own 2 feet, carrying their daughter, flanked by the man who had taught her that she was worth loving exactly as she was. "Thank you," she whispered to Kyle as they settled on the couch, Victoria contentedly nursing while he rubbed Ellie's aching back. "For what?" "For being crazy enough to love a cripple." Kyle's laugh was soft and full of wonder. "Best kind of crazy there is."